Good afternoon. I'm Aaron Klein, a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution, and it's my job on behalf of the Center of Market Regulation and Markets to welcome you to this interesting fireside chat that we're going to have here on the future of stablecoins. And sometimes in this policy and event and public planning world, it's better to be lucky than good. And we set out to have this conversation several weeks ago with Jeremy Allaire, the CEO and co-founder of Circle, which is the second largest stablecoin issuer in the world. And when we set this up a couple of weeks ago, we knew that there was a lot of conversation happening in Washington as it related to future regulation of stablecoins. This had been a priority of the president's working group on financial markets. But we had no idea that yesterday, in fact, the PWG, as it's called, which is the Treasury Secretary, the chair of the Federal Reserve, the chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission, chair of the CFTC, and joined in this instance by the comptroller of the currency and the chair of the FDIC, would all issue a giant report focused solely on stablecoins just yesterday. And that is really the lead issue. And I want to delve right into this with Jeremy, who, first of all, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I should note, in addition to co-founding Circle in 2013, that was after you'd already taken another company that you'd founded public on the NASDAQ exchange. You come as a veteran, not just of financial technology, but of building a business and an enterprise. And we'll get into what stablecoins are and why they've blown up and why they're attracting all this attention. But I want to delve right into the meat of the question here, which is that just yesterday, the president's working group on financial markets issued a large report dedicated solely to stablecoins. And they had three main recommendations. And I'm going to ask you to respond to each of the three. And let me read them to you. First one, quote, to address risks to stablecoin users and guard against stablecoin runs, legislation should require stablecoin issuers to be insured depository institutions, which are subject to appropriate supervision and regulation at the depository institution and the holding company level. End quote. Do you agree with this? Do you think that stablecoin issuers should become, in essence, banks subject to bank-like supervision and regulation?
So we do, in fact, multiple months ago, we announced that we were preparing to file an application with the OCC for a national commercial bank charter with Fed supervision and FDIC insurance, and specifically with the goal of establishing the first national full reserve digital currency bank in the United States. And that remains our intention, and it's good that it's aligned with how the Fed and Treasury and others are thinking about this. And I think that's my very quick answer. I think at a high level, of course, and we can get into this in subsequent parts of the conversation, there are many types of stablecoins in the market today. I think in particular, which is, I think, the focus of this report, asset-backed, dollar-denominated, aiming to be dollar payment system stablecoins, really belong at the federal level and really belong under that kind of banking and payment systems regulatory framework that we have. Now, clearly, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why they've asked Congress to become involved here, is that there's a lot of novelty. And maybe novelty is not the right word. There are a lot of significant differences in the way this technology for money works from prior banking and payment system technologies. And so there's a lot to work through in terms of building the statutes that would provide the right set of tools to the Fed or Treasury or others to actually supervise a national scale, if not international scale, stablecoin issuer such as Circle. So we're supportive of that recommendation. Again, there's a lot of devil in the details, obviously, but behind that, and there's a lot of, I think, significant issues, some of which are noted in the report as well, about what a full reserve dollar digital currency model like this looks like. What are the risks? how does this interact with the public internet and related technology? So there's a lot there, but I think at a high level, we do think that, and maybe just as a final comment on this topic, and I'm happy to drill into any detail, is, when we started this project, and we launched this over 3 years ago, we worked with banking regulators, payment system regulators throughout the country to build a product that worked within the fintech laboratories of the United States, which today are at the state level. PayPal, Square, Apple Pay, so many innovations that we take for granted in terms of digital money have really been in that fintech laboratory of state banking supervisors. And so we've had, I think, good regulators. We have a framework around money transmission technologies. And I think that was really the appropriate place to start, and that is how we're regulated today. But as these go from 30 billion to 100 billion to 500 billion in circulation, support potentially tens of trillions of dollars of transaction value, and become embedded in not just financial market activity, but deeper in the real economy and commerce, I think the stakes are a lot higher. And I think that's part of what you see in the report, is a recognition that these technologies, based on network effects, user bases, other things, can grow really, really fast. Like other things, like messaging apps grew really fast, or transportation systems like Uber grew really, really fast. And I think there's a recognition of, this could happen really quickly. And if that did, it could really have an impact on the financial system and the real world economy. And so let's get out ahead of that. And so I think in some ways we're seeing a desire to kind of upgrade from the fintech laboratories of the states to the federal level in a technology as fundamental as stablecoins.
So I think as I read the report, you could be a state chartered bank or a federally chartered bank and issue an IDI under the Treasury's proposed legislative framework. You could not be a credit union. So it's not really all insured depository institutions. It's really all banks and thrifts, because then your holding company would be regulated by the Federal Reserve,
right,
which would then be empowered to put in separations between banking and commerce, which get to the core of the second recommendation that I'd like you to respond to. So I have you down as yes, in agreement with recommendation number 1, become a bank. 2, this is the PWG report, and I quote, to address concerns about payment system risk, in addition to the requirements for stablecoin issuers, legislation should require custodial wallet providers to be subject to appropriate federal oversight. Congress should also provide that the federal supervisor of a stablecoin issuer with the authority to require any entity that performs activities that are critical to the functioning of the stablecoin arrangement to meet appropriate risk management standards. End quote. Agree or disagree?
I think there's components of that I think may make sense, and I think there's components that are very problematic. And I think part of this really, kind of connects to the nature of this technical innovation. So what's extraordinarily powerful about digital currencies like USDC and stablecoins, as we talk about them, is that they exist on the public internet. And the underlying infrastructure that they're built on top of, these blockchains, are basically operating systems that exist on the public internet. And they're operating systems that are not centrally managed and controlled. So when you think about operating systems today, like you have an operating system on your phone, you have an operating system on your desktop computer. As a business, you might put your software out in a cloud provider like an Amazon and host your software with operating systems there. Blockchains are like a new operating system on the internet, and they're designed to be extraordinarily tamper-resistant, resilient, decentralized, much like the internet was designed to be this resilient, decentralized infrastructure. Now, that technology, when you connect something like a dollar digital currency to it, it means that digital currency kind of exists everywhere that the internet exists. And like the open internet, which today is, I think the power of the open internet is something that we all take for granted. It's the air we breathe, which is that anyone can connect a device to the internet and kind of connect to any other device on the internet and conduct an incredible array of activities. These public blockchain networks provide these operating systems and economic infrastructure for an incredible amount of interactions. Now, if you take something like a stablecoin and you put it on that infrastructure, the power is the open network. The fact that software makers, hardware makers, regulated financial intermediaries all around the world can connect to these stablecoin protocols is an enormous amount of the value. It's what makes it possible for a digital currency like USDC for someone to settle a transaction at the speed of the internet, with the reach of the internet, at a fraction of a cent. And I think, to use an overused phrase, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so in a scenario where we say, well, any wallet that an intermediary is responsible for should be under like the Fed supervision. I mean, it's sort of like saying anyone who wants to run a mail server should be under the FCC's supervision. And that is sort of patently absurd to us today. But I think if you went back in time to when the Telecommunications Act was getting passed and when people were thinking about what licenses look like to perform, say, communications activity, I think there was sort of we have this structure of supervision that is very country specific, very domain specific, but the open internet kind of created a different set of expectations and capabilities. So I think, though, I think that's challenging. And I think it's challenging with how this works today and cuts against the grain of sort of the fundamental value proposition and innovation here. Now, I guess what I would look for is really I think probably underneath that goal or that suggestion is a set of concerns, and how do you address those concerns? So, in the United States today, for example, we have Treasury rules for firms that are involved in being custodians of convertible virtual currencies. Those are Treasury Department rules. If you are a custodial wallet in the United States, you must register with FinCEN. You must have a BSA AML program. You must conduct KYC. You must do transaction monitoring and all these sorts of
those are a series of anti-money laundering laws and regulations enforced by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN. Keep going. I just want to.
That's right. And I think if you're providing that as a service to institutions or individuals, you may find yourself as a regulated money transmitter, and therefore also have legal obligations to register with banking regulators throughout the United States and register and be supervised and be licensed. And so we have a structure today which requires custodial wallets to be regulated. They're regulated at the federal level by FinCEN and IRS, and they're regulated at the state level as well. And so there is regulation there, I think, and that's effective. Now, if what they're getting at is they're saying custodial wallets, that there should be some national license for that is separate from the money transmission statutes that we have today, that's a discussion to have. But I think that the notion, the deeper notion here, which is in the comment, that every entity that is involved in it should be, subject to sort of indirect supervision or direct supervision, etc. I think that's very, very challenging. That's like, sort of saying, I'll give a real world example. Most consumer banking today happens through mobile apps and through web applications on computers. And underneath that, there's a lot of pieces of the ecosystem, right? There's internet service providers. There's, there are companies that run web hosting. There are companies that issue digital certificates for securing the websites. There are, so many technology components to delivering that. But no one is suggesting that like the Fed should supervise ISPs because banking is delivered through internet software. And so I think the same thing here. We have to really figure out, what are we really talking about here? Are we talking about financial intermediaries and their conduct, or are we talking about pieces of the technology architecture?
Let's drill into that, because I think what they're saying is that essentially, to use your example, the federal regulators are empowered to look at third-party vendor management. And the exact line that the PWG says, to meet appropriate risk management standards. So it's not that the bank regulator goes into the web host or goes into the third-party provider.
Sure.
But that if you're vending services to a bank that are critical to that bank's operation, then the regulator has the authority to make sure that you, as the critical intermediary provider, are meeting appropriate risk management standards. Your system isn't going to have an outage.
Yeah, so I think conceptually that all makes sense, right? So we run, fairly, just as a company, right, fairly significant enterprise risk management, information security management, and as a regulated firm have various, cyber requirements and so on. I think the tricky part here is really the fact that digital currencies like stablecoins run on the public internet. They depend on the public internet. They depend on public infrastructure that is not operated by any company. It's not operated by any government, just like the internet itself is not operated by a country or a government. And it's the first time ever that fundamental economic and financial infrastructure is actually outsourced to the internet, to decentralized infrastructure on the internet. That's not something that, the CPMI or PFMI standards, these international kind of standards for payment market infrastructure or other things have ever contemplated. They've just never contemplated the fact that you could have direct peer-to-peer value exchange over a public internet infrastructure. And so my own view is, I think this is the ultimately, right, we're thinking about resilience, risk management, infrastructure security, reliability. And I think this is a process where banking regulators in particular, and the standards, the enterprise risk standards that they expect, will need to come up with an approach to financial institutions that are interacting with these public networks. It's no different than saying, I'm a bank that's going to provide a way for my customers to store and transmit Bitcoin. It's the exact same issue, right? Well, who runs the Bitcoin network? Well, a decentralized network of miners run the Bitcoin network. Well, how do we supervise them? Well, you can't supervise them. So it's the same kind of issue.
So let me say that because Neha Narula, who's an expert on this at MIT and is integrally involved with some of the constructing that's occurring upon the Federal Reserve's potential to create a central bank digital currency, she wrote on a recent piece, quote, "The blockchain itself might be at risk if a stable coin which runs on it becomes too big, especially compared to the monetary base of the blockchain's native token. Stablecoin providers can have influence on the blockchain's governance by only honoring the version of the stablecoin on one side of a blockchain fork, for example, even if it's not the side that most blockchain users prefer. Or a stablecoin issuer could choose to honor tokens on either side in different ways." She goes on to list other examples. How would you respond to Neha's concern about this very blockchain nature that you raise as a reason why the regulatory structure proposed by the PWG may be problematic? She's pointing out that very structure creates opportunities for a stablecoin issuer to engage in a way that could require greater supervision and regulation. What would be your response to Neha?
Yeah, I know Neha well. I've known her for a very long time. And she's extraordinarily bright and thoughtful. And I know she's obviously thinking about new kind of crypto money transaction architectures for the Fed as well. So I think, again, coming back to the analogy, and I actually think it's more than an analogy. I think it's more almost factual, that blockchains are like operating systems, and there's a lot of intense competition for these new internet operating systems, and these new internet operating systems are usable for many, many types of applications. A stablecoin is one application that you can build on one of these operating systems. There are games, there are social networks, there are other fiduciary applications, there are commerce applications, there are digital intellectual property applications. There are so many different applications, and we haven't even thought of the 500 that haven't even been come up with, that have not yet been, developed. So really important infrastructure, and is the Web3 kind of concept, this new infrastructure layer of the internet, is what we're building on. Now, we have chosen to take a multi-blockchain approach because there is this competition. And my sort of philosophy, and our philosophy, has been, if you have a protocol for dollars on the internet, like USDC, that you want your digital dollars to be cross-platform. It would be like saying you can only use your music on an Apple device. You want to be able to, use your media or conduct your communications, whether you're on a personal computer, on a web browser, on an Apple device, on a Sony device, whatever that is. You want cross-platform. It's a concept that I think consumers intuitively understand today. And I think the same thing holds for digital money and for digital currency. And so being multi-blockchain is essentially that kind of being multi-platform. Now, it may be, and I think it would be totally appropriate for, when a stablecoin becomes very large in terms of its role in economic activity, to sort of say, there's a whole series of requirements for what are deemed to be kind of acceptable public network infrastructures to run on top of. Or if there are newer public infrastructures that emerge that are supported, that you've got very robust risk management standards around issues that could occur, resolution, other things. So I think there's a lot of work to do. As I like to say, there's no OCC exam manual for running a digital currency on a blockchain in a bank. Well, there's going to have to be. We're going to have to come up with that exam manual. We're going to have to come up with how to deal with those scenarios. And the answer can't just be it's open to the market. These are market conduct issues. These are risk issues. And so I'm actually, ultimately, I'm encouraged, because I think part of what you're seeing reflected in the PWG report is an understanding that this is a new architecture for money, and that this is a new financial market architecture. And the answer is not just slam it into the old one. It's actually, no, there are some distinct entities and roles and risks, and let's get those out on the table and figure out the right way to think about risk management on them. So I'm encouraged by the fact that that's thematically something that the PWG is focused on. I just think at a high level, if you just take that descriptor, there's just so many devils in the detail, and there's so much that has to be considered and worked through. But I think constructive engagement at an industry level and an ecosystem level can kind of ultimately lead to good outcomes on that.
So let's drill down, because you really do tease into the third of the three PWG recommendations, which I'll quote. To address additional concerns about systemic risk and concentration of economic power, legislation should require stablecoin issuers to comply with activities restrictions that limit affiliations with commercial entities. Supervisors should have authority to implement standards to promote interoperability among stablecoins. In addition, Congress may wish to consider other standards for custodial wallet providers, such as limitations on affiliation with commercial entities or on use of users' transaction data, end quote. So as I read that, there are three recommendations. One, enforce the separation of banking and commerce on stablecoin issuers who now have fallen under the banking side of the banking and commerce ledger, right? One of the core problems, as you point out, is the U.S. defines banking and commerce. Payments is not part of the bank definition legally in the U.S.
Right.
But because banks have dominated payments for so long, it's just simply been assumed, and as fintech unbundles payments, they have been shown to be part of the commercial side of the ledger. So one, separating banking and commerce, in which Circle would find itself on the bank side. Two, the authority to implement standards to promote interoperability among stablecoins. I think I heard you say yes to that.
Yeah,
and three,
I'm happy to address. Yeah.
Okay, hold on. And then three, standards for custodial wallet providers, including their affiliation with commercial entities and data usage on consumers. So these are kind of three recommendations in the third. Please go respond to each of them.
Yeah. So if you kind of peek beneath the surface on that, clearly components of this are very specifically directed at the company formerly known as Facebook, and very, very clearly directed at that. And I'm sure the angst and the anxiety that exists with a supranational scale internet entity kind of usurping the fundamental financial market or payment infrastructure, that's obviously provoked a lot of concern in the market. And so I think pieces of that are aimed at that. I guess if you kind of break those down, I think if you accept that the issuance and the kind of administration and operation of a dollar stablecoin is a banking activity, as we do accept, then being on that side of the ledger, as you say, and the separation of commerce from that, I think that makes sense. I think that component makes sense. Now, I think when you get to the next level down, which is today, money transmission law, and in the United States in particular, and in many other parts of the world, e-money law, payment systems law, all these exist, do allow non-banks to operate payment systems and to operate payment technologies and to facilitate it. However, the underlying, say, core banking, the underlying money itself is not something that's allowed. And so non-banks work with banks. Circle's an example of that today. We work with banks to access the FedWire system and other things, right? So I think that that clearly, and that's where I'd sort of say custodial wallet providers. Like if I'm running a payment application and I'm from a technology, if I'm Google and I run Google Pay and that's a payment application and it's a wallet, or I'm Robinhood and I have a wallet, or I'm Coinbase and I have a wallet, or I'm PayPal and I have a wallet, those firms should be able to have wallets and operate services that include payment services as part of that. I think the notion that you would not allow all these different types of firms to compete in that arena would be extraordinarily anti-competitive. I think it would be extraordinarily poor for actual outcomes for society and individuals and others. And so I don't think that's what's intended. But if you read it really, really closely, you'd say, no, actually, you can't be in those businesses necessarily. So that would be like an enormous about face in the face of what has been an extraordinary amount of fintech innovation in the United States. So I think, again, devil's in the details what are we getting at with this kind of custodial wallet separation of activities thing? I think an attempt to, in a legislative way, I mean, is it really just a carve out for Facebook? Is this really just an attempt to say, we really don't want Facebook to have anything to do with money at all? And so we're going to have a law that says if they're dealing with stablecoins and they have a wallet and they're associated with a commercial non-financial activity, that it's banned. I mean, that's kind of absurd. And so again, I think there's like, go beneath the surface. What are you really getting out there to define that?
One possibility is that they're laying groundwork for the adoption of a Federal Reserve digital currency, but don't want to go the following step of allowing people direct access to Federal Reserve accounts, which has been proposed by Morgan Ricks, Lev Menard, some academics. Bills on the Hill, there's a lot of energy around Fed accounts. And so they want the wallet intermediary to be a banking subsidiary to avoid having the central bank provide its own Fed account as it links to its own central bank digital currency. This is somewhat speculative. I don't want to get meta in my analysis, to use a bad pun, and build off of your point. To build off of an earlier point you made about the speed of this, I've done some research on China's payment system, and they leapfrogged our silly cards and swipe fees and all the rest, and just went straight to QR codes run by Ali and Alipay and WeChat, Chinese Facebook and Chinese Amazon, and which were way more efficient and faster than the very FedWire you mentioned. And frankly, gave great benefits to their consumers. And then the Chinese government is now clawing them back systemically and introducing a central bank digital currency. What's your view on all of that? On the CBDC, on this digital wallet question? What would happen if they took their own regulation and applied it to credit cards and Fed accounts and Visa and all this stuff, as you're kind of pointing out?
I mean, look, there's a lot on this topic, and we should probably spend a few minutes on it. I think, first, I think it's worth noting, laddering off of what you shared about China, which is, you're absolutely correct. The attempt or the explicit activity of creating an ECNY, which is not
electronic Chinese yuan.
Yes,
ECNY.
Electronic Chinese yuan, right? Is a direct response to the very significant large-scale market power that exists, private market power that exists in payment systems in China. That is a direct response, and the desire for there to be a third way, a defined public option, so to speak, and I think also very much tied into a re-centralization of power under an authoritarian regime that seeks to have omniscience and control, and to extract value away from the private sector back to the public sector. And we can all talk about that across not just the financial system, other areas as well. What I find incredibly, disconcerting, frankly, is the degree to which policymakers in the West are enamored with what China is doing. And there's almost a, how do we out China China? How do we out China China? And I think it's very dangerous, in my view. What may seem fashionable, which is to nationalize infrastructure, put it under government administration and control and government development, and push to the side the private sector, I think is extraordinarily dangerous for the West. And it is trying to out China China. And I think it's very problematic. I think what's interesting about the advance of electronic money in the world is that the advance of electronic money in the world has overwhelmingly been through private sector innovation, through consortiums of private sector actors building new form factors, new technological form factors, and building standards and interoperability and driving that at scale, whether it's the international wire messaging system, the advent of mag stripes and card readers, and eventually the ledger systems that supported what we think of as the first real scaled form of electronic money, to more common advancements that we know of today, like PayPal and Apple Pay and things like that. And this is around the world. And the private sector has played an enormous role, not only in payment system innovation, it's played this incredibly enormous role in the issuance of money itself, right? The vast majority of electronic money we deal with today is privately issued money. It's not public money, it's privately issued money, regulated privately issued money. But I think where I'm going with this is simply to say, there's a set of, I think, ideals, which I think are actually enshrined in the internet itself. Ideals of openness, of free competition, of open intellectual property, of decentralization as a value, something that pushes power and creativity and other things out further. Those are values, and those are values in the internet. And I think Western liberal market democratic and similar ideals have have actually given rise to an incredible amount, not just in market economies, but also in what the internet is for us today. And I actually look at technologies like stablecoins and public blockchains and the smart contracts and all the stuff that's happening there as incredible and beautiful examples of what happens when you embrace that set of values of openness, of open intellectual property, of decentralization, and of private sector innovation. And I don't think we want to miss out on that, because that's happening at a really fast pace. It's happening at an incredibly fast pace. And I think the importance of the PWG report is it's acknowledging that what's happening on the open internet and what's happening in the private sector is growing really fast, and it's going to get even bigger. And it is something that needs to be regulated. But I think, I also like to point out is people sort of say we're behind China on this. Actually, it's absolutely the opposite. We are way ahead of China. China's got a beta test of a government-controlled thing that's had tens of billions of RMB of transactions. I think there's like $5 trillion of stablecoin US dollar stablecoin transactions, and it's growing like crazy, and tons of companies are connecting to it. And so we're actually winning. The West is winning the digital currency space race right now.
So it's interesting you say that, because I mean, you'll find no bigger proponent of the failure or argue the failure of the Federal Reserve and the US government to make money move faster in the United States for people. I mean, the scariest part about Halloween for me is if you deposited a payment on Friday in your bank account, October 29th, it wasn't available until Tuesday, November 2nd.
Right.
And,
right. They're using cryptocurrency, it's 400 milliseconds, and it doesn't cost you a penny.
That's right. Right. Instead, it costs billions of dollars in $35 overdraft fees, in check cashing fees. 70%, my research has shown 70% of check casher customers have bank accounts in the US because the US banking system fails to work for them. And decades of Federal Reserve studying of faster payments has led to very little benefit, as the very banks the Federal Reserve and the OCC regulates make tens of billions of dollars in fees off of that same product. And there's a very real tension between the central bank as a payment operator and a payment regulator and a bank regulator. But I can't let you off the hook, Jeremy, because you talk about all these great innovations, and I see a lot of that point. But there's some pretty big spectacular failures that occur in this caveat emptor private world.
Totally.
The largest stablecoin issuer, Tether, has recently had a $1 million bounty placed on it by a private short seller saying, show us your assets that back this coin. I know you guys have put out statements written by in response to that, and then people have quibbled with your statements, your definition of commercial paper, how fully dollar denominated backed you are. I don't know if you want to discuss the $1 million bounty on Tether, or if you want to answer a question that says something to the effect of, if every stablecoin issuer had to reveal where their money was, are you confident that every single one of them on a platform today would be fully dollar reserved? Or do you think that if you opened that kimono behind or peered behind that curtain, you would find several stablecoin issuers who are not being fully transparent, and for whom there could be real risks to their users?
Absolutely. I mean, look, there's a reason why USDC is regulated and supervised by banking regulators under the same laws that supervise the balances you hold at PayPal or with Apple or with Square, which is a full reserve, one-for-one redeemability with consumer protection laws that protect you from insolvency, that specifically supervise on compliance, anti-money laundering, information security standards, all these things. Those things have applied to us since day one. And those statutes exist so that people have confidence in these electronic payment systems. And I think that's really important. There are absolutely other stablecoin issuers who ignore that entirely and who we don't know the answer. And so I think what it speaks to is, in the United States, for firms that are domiciled in the United States that are operating in the stablecoin space, we're all under these regulations, and we've been under those since day one. Now, I think there are sort of philosophical discussions of what is the appropriate liquidity on a stored value electronic money instrument. Is it cash and cash equivalents, or is it something outside of that? The regulators in the United States who supervise all of the major fintechs out there have differing definitions of what is permissible for those underlying dollar denominated assets that need to be liquid for users for these payment systems. There are different definitions. We've, based on market feedback and based on really where we see things going at a federal level and from a ultimately bank charter level, we've opted for the most conservative position possible there. But it's all under a regulatory framework. It's not like we're just making these decisions in a vacuum. We have to do it.
Well, but let me push back on this regulatory framework, right? Bernie Madoff operated in a regulatory framework. I think he was even elected to, strong roles of self-governing and self-regulatory operations. A lot of people have compared stable coins to money market mutual funds. Actually, one of the shortcomings I found in the PWG report is they don't even mention money market mutual funds in the entire report, right? I kind of read the thing and go, wow, I can't wait till these guys find out that there's a multi-trillion-dollar business called money market mutual funds. What are they going to think of how they are regulated, right? Because they're promising, in essence, a one-to-one, you can't lose money, but we'll give you interest.
Well, clearly, if you're offering an investment contract where you're saying to someone, invest your dollars and I will hold them and give you a return, that's an investment contract and that's a security, and that's pretty clear. I think when you have a balance with PayPal, or you store value in a USDC digital currency, or you're using Apple Pay cash or cash, you're not making an investment in that case. You're not looking at the investment and the return on that investment and so on. And that's why money transmission law and the statutes around that exist. And, I think if you're questioning whether the state of New York and California and Texas are effective examiners, and the other statutory, fiduciaries that are involved in supervising these regulated financial institutions are not effective, that's a different question.
So no, I'm asking a different question. I'm going to ask a question because this kind of came up in terms of a paper. Tim Masad, who was the chairman of the CFTC, another market regulator, and we published his paper on stablecoins in Brookings. And Tim writes, quote, "Although I have compared stablecoin risk to those of money market mutual funds, I do not think that is the best way to regulate them. They are fundamentally payment devices and not investments. Classifying them as securities would also appear to preempt a systemic importance determination as part of the payment authority given under the Dodd-Frank law that talks about the definition of payment, settlement, and clearing activity for purposes of he goes on to write, and I'm paraphrasing him here, that the Financial Stability Oversight Committee, the so-called Jedi Mind Council of bank regulators, who interestingly did not put out this report, even though a majority of their members did under a different organization. You can guess which ones weren't included in going under A versus B, but the FSOC has an authority, and the PWG report talks about their authority to do designations. Tim is making the argument that these are not money market, that you're not really an investment vehicle and shouldn't be treated like that. And I would contrast him, the question that came in from the audience, which is, do you agree, and you can hashtag stablecoin to ask your own question on this, and it's a, do you agree with SEC Chairman Gensler's comments that a majority of stablecoins are securities and thus under SEC jurisdiction? So you have Masad over here saying that analogously, you're offering something, there's an analogy to money market mutual funds, particularly as it relates to run risk. And then over here, you have the SEC chairman who has jurisdiction over money market mutual funds, arguing that most of your issuances do fall under them under current law. Where do you fall on this?
I mean, look, there are actually hundreds of different stablecoin projects out in the digital assets world. And there are stablecoins issued by financial institutions in Indonesia, in Europe, in Brazil, in a lot of markets. So there are a lot of stablecoins. There are many stablecoins that are issued algorithmically by software that are collateralized with different crypto assets, that there is no corporate issue where there's just software. So there's a huge range of things that are out there. I think, and I don't profess to be an expert on each and every one of those in all the different jurisdictions in which those are issued. If a financial institution's got authority from the payment and electronic money regulators in Indonesia to launch a rupee token, I would say that's an Indonesian matter. Now, if you're issuing something that is asset-backed in the United States, that is providing a dollar payment technology, you are either operating under the laws that exist on electronic money and payment systems in the United States, or you're not. And so I think the first question is not, are these securities or not? I think the first question is are these legally operating under the regulatory framework that we have in place today for payment technologies? Now, are there potentially stablecoins, dollar referenced stablecoins that are conducting investment products in some way? That's an open question as well. Again, I don't profess to be an expert on every single project that is out there. What I would say is, a dollar referenced dollar asset-backed stablecoin that is trying to operate within a compliant framework that exists in the United States today, and is, say, backed by Bitcoin loans and obligations, would not survive the statutory treatments that exist for money transmission in the United States. They wouldn't. They would be outside of that. So, I mean, look, I think very clearly, there's a reason why the good actors and the regulated players in the United States have been operating under well-defined statutes and payment systems since day one. It's, to me, there may be stablecoins that are backed by baskets of securities. There may be stablecoins that are pegged to stocks and bonds and other things that are stable against the reference price of a stock. Those things probably are securities. They look a lot like securities. So I think there are clearly things that you could put over there. In the dollar stablecoin space, and certainly the space that we've been operating in for years now, I think it's pretty cut and dry what these things are.
So let's talk a little bit more about stable coins, because we only have a little over 10 minutes left. Talk a little bit about what your company is doing, and talk a little bit about some of the innovation and potential that you have to be more inclusive. I kind of, note that money market mutual funds, who pose a lot of the same run risk that the PWG report is so hyper conscious of, have been bailed out in each of the last two recessions by the Federal Reserve. And that, it doesn't escape my attention that a staggering amount of money market mutual fund investors are old and white. And they get bailed out repeatedly in crises. Stable coins, it's hard to know who's in them to some degree. I'd love to know what information you guys have. My own observations seem to be that they skew younger than money market mutual funds. And the correlation with age and race in this country is astounding as well. One of my favorite new statistics has to do with modal age. And most people, when they remember stats, remember mean, median, and mode, but we only ever talk about mean, average, or median, middle. We don't talk about mode, the most frequent. But if you put all white people in America in a room and you lined up by age and birth year, there'd be more people under the queue of 57 years old than any other age. If you did the same for African Americans, it would be 27. And if you did the same for Latinos, it would be 11. Younger people are far browner than older people. And if you believe younger people are more into cryptocurrency, trading assets, have Coinbase accounts or other digital wallets, are dealing in Bitcoin, Ethereum, Tether, Circle, whatever, which is certainly my belief. And there's some data to support that, although data is difficult to come by in this space. You can't help but notice that this is a younger crowd, inherently more racially diverse. Talk a little bit about how that is, and talk about, what would just, what lessons, if any, have regulators learned from their decision repeatedly to bail out money market mutual funds in the form of a crisis or a run? And what might happen, if there were a crisis in the run in stablecoins? Would regulators treat them the same as money market mutual funds? And so talk a little bit about that, and take a moment. I realize we've delved straight into the policy. As a bit of a policy nerd and wonk, I haven't given you a moment to breathe and talk a little bit about the company and
Sure.
who you guys are reaching and what you're doing. So it's a little bit of a grab bag to respond to here towards the end, but there's some.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Aaron. I would start, with a couple of kind of high level thoughts on this. I'll separate out the bailout question for a moment, and because I do think it kind of connects back to the earlier discussion very, very clearly. But I think our view, and really, I helped found this over 8 years ago, and I think the insight that we had when we were starting this was that this new technology of cryptographic money and of these public internet transaction and other networks, these blockchain networks, we had the insight that those could, over time, once they became scalable enough, meaning they could handle a lot more transactions, and once they became what I call extensible, meaning like you could not just have a Bitcoin, but you could have other referenceable assets, and you could write code that, automated transactions around them, smart contracts, things like this, that would give way to, and ultimately get to a point where we could have protocols for money on the internet, just like we have protocols for information and communications and data on the internet. And that could work at internet scale. And that once that worked at internet scale, once you had, as I call it, the HTTP of money, right? HTTP is the protocol that is the web and how we do this. Once you have that, then that would unlock an incredible amount, right? It would, in our view, ultimately bring the cost of storing and moving value to zero, just like the cost of storing and moving data is effectively zero for almost any person or business today. It would open up the reach to anyone in the world that could connect to the internet, and it would bring those costs down. Now, we're on our way there. We're 8 years into the journey. The technology to make that possible is really arriving now. We think in the next 2 to 3 years, it will be at a point where 1 billion plus people could interact with it, safely and easily on the internet, or more. And that has incredible potential to, obviously, from a financial inclusion perspective, be extraordinarily powerful, but also just returning value to the real economy in terms of the taxes and time delays and other things that go on with money today. And then more importantly, we don't exist in a domestic context only. We exist in a global context. Everything we do happens in this global context. And commerce itself, as we're seeing with supply shortages and other interdependencies in the global economy, commerce itself, internet native commerce, all of this is just growing and growing. And we need a new economic infrastructure that is built on the internet in this age to do that. And I believe that digital currency and blockchains provide for that. And I think that's going to lead to, I think, very, very significant innovations in the nature of commerce on the internet. And that will be value creating for the firms and the users and the individuals and the households and others around the world. So I really believe that this is contributing to something much, much larger. And we're making good progress there. And I think if one, say, looks at this narrowly through the lens of payment systems, I think it's actually missing the picture, because in our view, it would be like trying to look at the internet through the lens of long distance telephone providers, which is maybe what people did in the early days of the internet. That's not a helpful way to think about what the internet did for communications. And I think similarly, if you're looking at this narrowly through the lens of payment systems, you're missing the picture of a fabric of commerce and financial activity that can happen intermediated on the internet in these new ways. So I think that's what I think is at stake. And actually, just coming back to the policy side for a moment, I think this is like fundamental national economic competitiveness stuff. And I think one of the really important missing pieces of the policy discussion, it's all been about the risks, the run risks, the financial crime risks, which are real, and those are real, so we have to deal with them. But we've got other risks, which are economic competitiveness risks, national security risks, and national security and economic competitiveness are kind of two sides of the same coin in some respects. And how does the United States ensure that the dollar and dollar digital currency and the economic infrastructure of blockchains, which are a profound innovation, how does it ensure that the United States is leading and advancing that? Because that's in the interest of the country, and that's in the interest of the households and firms within the country. And so I feel like we need to really start to shape the debate a little bit to how do we take advantage of all this infrastructure that's happening and support it and build on it and make the United States a champion for this advancement. And so there's more work to do, to educate on all of that.
There's a huge mistake policymakers are making, right? Millions of children went hungry when the COVID economy shut down. Congress responded radically quickly by authorizing initial stimulus payments by the end of March. Congress passed a law putting $1,500 out there before the unemployment numbers were even released. There are a bunch of people that want automatic policy and just let the stabilizers work. Right. And they don't realize Congress authorized the money before even the data were available, right? Because common sense showed you that March 31 was nothing like March 1.
Right.
And their children starving.
Yeah.
And guess how long it took that money in a pandemic emergency to reach people, right? Nobody got money before April 15th.
Yeah, it's awful. Yeah.
Millions of people didn't get their money till September.
Yeah.
Right? So this isn't just about economic competitiveness. Now, how many policymakers' children went hungry?
Right.
How many people, watching this webcast's children went hungry? We just assumed the money was coming. To this day, the child tax credit, 1 out of 8 families is waiting on a paper check.
Yeah.
This is the single biggest way to alleviate child poverty in America. And the U.S. Treasury Department is sending paper checks in the mail.
Well,
years
I
into the
agree with
COVID
you.
experience.
Wholeheartedly agree with you. And this is clearly a public-private sector opportunity, right? Not just a public sector opportunity. It's an opportunity, for advancement in the private sector in support of these public policy objectives.
But I wish the federal government, I wish the U.S. Treasury Department would contract with anybody that wasn't the Federal Reserve, because the Fed can't get you their money any faster. Right. There are all these ways to get the money faster.
Yeah.
Right. But we refuse to. It isn't a public-private. It's a public. Right. And so, and listen, I'm all for a public system. If we could have built a better system and had a better system, the UK has a better system. Singapore got their money out the same afternoon in an hour, right? It's not as if this technology doesn't exist or that only the private sector knows how to implement real-time payments. To the contrary.
Yeah.
So, Jeremy, we're coming up to the very, very last minute. So last question in closing, I want to ask you, because you've had, look, I have to give my hat off to you. 8 years ago, you came up with this idea and you founded this company. And I don't think anybody would have credibly thought that 8 years later, there'd be the President's Working Group on Financial Markets dedicating a report to the issuance of stablecoins and all of this. Give me 8 years in the future. What is going to be the real change if this system is well regulated and allowed to advance? So, because you can see a mistake in either direction you've laid out. It can be overly regulated, it can be underly regulated.
Yeah. So equilibrium, it's well regulated and can achieve mainstream scale. I mean, look, I think there are a number of things. I think one is that the cost of moving money just becomes zero. And that means the cost of receiving a payment as a business, a small business, a merchant, goes to zero. It means the ability to transact internationally, costs approach zero, and have the speed and convenience of the internet. Just like we take for granted that we can have a video call with anyone anywhere at no cost, we will take for granted that just value moves in that way, in that same kind of way. That's, I think, very significant. I think a second piece is that, in particular, as we think about the internationalization of this technology, it will become, just as seamless as we send an email or a text message and we don't think about what country someone is in, right? As I like to say, when's the last time that you sent a cross-border email? The concept is just absurd, right? Will be an anachronism and will seem silly, right? It'll be like, well, it's just the internet, right? So I think things like that will occur. I think the more dramatic things, though, are going to come from the ability to take advantage of what is often referred to as the programmability of money. Once money in the form of dollars or euros, but let's just talk about dollars for the moment, actually becomes a native type of data on the internet that can be programmed with contracts. And those contracts can be executed and enforced by machines on the internet, AKA smart contracts. Once you develop that at scale, I believe it can lead to very significant transformations in what we think of as capital markets activity, in access to credit, in the provisioning of lending on a global basis. I think that will lead to not just more efficiencies and a lower cost, but it will lead to more access to these types of financial services for firms and households all around the world. And so I think there's deeper things that can happen with the nature of capital markets and what we think of as commercial banking and things like that today can shift into this and bring the kind of internet scale unit economic benefits and access benefits that we've seen in so many other industries. You can bring that into finance. And so I think we can see strong progress towards those in the next 8 years.
Well, some of those sound very exciting to me, particularly the allocation of credit on a much smarter system than,
Exactly.
did you get divorced or have a medical emergency 6 years ago, dinging your
Right.
made up 3-digit FICO score that's made up to look like an SAT to pretend like it's relevant.
Right.
On the other hand, I'm terrified about zero transaction costs, because then how am I going to get my credit card rewards?
Well, there's
which
plenty
keep
of ways
getting
to
bigger
build
and bigger.
incentives and loyalty. Those aren't necessarily tied to
No, but I mean, those are mostly currently come out of large swipe fees paid by merchants and lower income people.
Yeah, no,
with cash,
absolutely.
right?
So I think, again, the nature of affinity and loyalty and how that's operationalized, there's plenty of room for innovation in that goes beyond what we think of as, these swipe fees and other things. I think crypto technology actually can be a pretty important piece of that as well.
Well, that's a perfect note to end and maybe bring you back for a second conversation on that, because I'm really interested in that in the future. So I just want to thank you very much, Jeremy Allaire, the CEO of Circle, for joining us today. And thank you all, and wish everybody a wonderful afternoon.